We're joined on the line by Dr. Sam Baars, who is a director of research at the think tank, the Centre for Education and Youth, and gave evidence to the Education Select Committee on its inquiry into working class white pupils. Welcome to the programme.
Hi, Sasha. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So my first question to you, I don't know if you've heard my introduction, but I wonder if it's useful or relevant to talk specifically about white working class boys as opposed to just working class boys. What do you think?
I think you framed it really well in your introduction, and as always, I think it was great that you quoted Akala, because he always manages to find a really succinct way of setting it up just right, I think. And one thing I really agree with is that I would argue that class is a particularly, I think people think that class is kind of dissolved. We're in a classless society, but we're really not. Class really matters, but you can say that without saying that ethnicity doesn't matter. I think there is definitely a real issue with arguing that one thing, if one thing matters, then everything else doesn't matter. So I think young people who from working class backgrounds face a number of difficulties. At the Centre for Education and Youth, we focus primarily on young people's experiences in the education system. And we know, whether it's at higher education or right the way back to the early years and into primary school, that young kids from working class backgrounds do face a range of challenges. And that's true of working class kids from any ethnic group. So the data suggests that whatever ethnic group you're from, if you're working class, your life chances are going to be substantially different to those of other kids from a middle class background. But that doesn't mean that being working class means exactly the same thing for every person. I mean, speak to anyone who identifies as being working class, and they would argue the same thing. They'd say, well, it's something very personal. It means something specific to them. And people, there's this idea of intersectionality. It's a kind of a clumsy word, and it can seem quite academic, but I think it's actually a really important concept. It means that, if you're a black woman and you're disabled, then those three things mean something in their own right, but also put together, they mean something very specific and very unique. Your class background can compound the difficulties you might face by being from a particular ethnic group, and your gender can do exactly the same. So that's why we don't see exactly the same outcomes for working class kids from different ethnic groups. But Akala is right that on the whole, it's the fact that they're working class that really seems to matter. They all do worse.
And did you, in the course of your research, notice any regional disparities? Are children from the north of England who are working class, do they perform differently from the south, for example?
It's a really good question. Area really matters. So the part of the country that you're from really matters. Part of that is because of, I think, the idea of being working class is really strongly rooted to history and to place. And I think if you're, just to take two examples from the top of my head, if you're a working class kid from a former mining town in the north of England, that means something quite different to being a working class kid from, say, the former manufacturing heartland of East London. You both might identify as being from a working class family, but that means something quite different. So place definitely matters. And actually, I think this idea of class is often quite related to area. We know that there are regional disparities in how kids do at school. There are regional disparities in the proportions of kids going on to university. But actually, I think focusing on the topic at a regional level is less helpful than focusing on it at a neighbourhood level. That's where a lot of my research has focused. And some of the most interesting stuff that I've found out is that there seems to be something about growing up on the edge of an urban centre, kind of out on the fringes, that seems to have a really significant impact on how young people conceive of their futures, how they think they're going to do, what kind of opportunities they want to engage with. That's really different to kids growing up in equally poor but quite inner urban areas.
Interesting.
So I think that's a more important distinction than the one about regions.
When I was reading the King's College report on the underrepresentation of white working class boys in higher education, it seemed to kind of dismiss the issue as cultural and suggest it was because white working class parents don't have high enough aspirations for their sons. That's certainly one of the big messages that I took from it. Is there any truth in that, do you think? Or do you think that's an unhelpful stereotype?
So I think our report was really strongly arguing against the idea that In fact, the reason why any group of young people might do, say, poorly at school is due to cultural factors. I think it's one of those things that we tend to assume that if kids aren't doing well at school, it's probably because their parents don't really care about how they're doing. They don't really have very high aspirations for them. Actually, when all kids are really quite young, we know from research and from existing evidence that pretty much across the board, all parents have really, really high hopes for their kids. Anyone who's a parent knows that feeling. So that's something that's shared across all parents from all different sorts of backgrounds. But the trajectories of those aspirations, when they're held by young people, do actually then start to shift around in different ways as they go through school. And this is where I think things do look a little bit different for white working class kids and boys in particular, is there seems to be this process of their aspirations of what they want to do when they're older, kind of really dropping off as they go through school. I don't think we know all the reasons for that, but I think that's potentially a factor. There's also something around the kind of support that parents are able to give their kids while they're at school. And the data suggests it's fairly marginal, but working class parents who are white are slightly less likely to help their kids with their homework or to read with them. Often that's because they might lack the resources to do so, or they might have had a really, really, really poor time at school when they are at school. So their ability to engage with that kind of stuff is harder. That's a very different thing to them not having high aspirations or not wanting their kids to do well and not valuing education. I think often they hugely value education. They just struggle to know exactly how to convert that into opportunities for their kids.
Dr. Sam Baars, Director of Research at the think tank, the Centre for Education and Youth.